He lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, a place where people smiled politely but didn't really know each other. The streets were lined with modest houses, each with a small lawn and a few trees. Mailboxes stood neatly by the sidewalks and cars were parked in driveways, their owners going about their daily routines. On the surface it was peaceful, but beneath that calm, there were tensions that many chose to ignore. He had moved here a few years ago, wanting to escape the chaos of the city and find a place where life could be simple. Every morning he would wake up early, make himself a cup of coffee, and sit on his porch for a few minutes. The air was crisp, and the sun would rise slowly over the rooftops, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks. He liked these moments of quiet, when nothing demanded his attention and he could just breathe. Most neighbors saw him as quiet, polite, and somewhat mysterious. He rarely spoke about his past or even his job. He kept to himself, smiled when people passed by, and nodded in greeting. Children would wave to him and he would wave back. But he never played along or tried to be overly friendly. There was a certain calmness about him that made people uneasy and curious at the same time. He worked a regular job, something that didn't draw attention. Some days were busy, some slow. He didn't complain and he didn't brag about anything. But beneath the calm exterior, there was a strength that no one around him could imagine. His life was simple on purpose. He had learned long ago that a low profile kept trouble away, and he liked it that way. The neighborhood had its usual mix of people. Some were kind and welcoming, others suspicious and quick to judge. Among them, there was a small group who had never accepted anyone different from themselves. They whispered and muttered when he walked by. Some crossed the street to avoid him. He noticed, of course. He always noticed. He had learned to read people very carefully. But he didn't respond with anger. Not yet. He simply observed, taking mental notes. The first warning signs appeared slowly. A few notes left on his door, unsigned and crude, hinting at disapproval. The messages were filled with hate, the kind of hate that felt old and deep, the kind that grew quietly and fed on fear. He didn't panic. He folded the notes, put them away, and went about his day. There was no reason to react yet. Reacting without purpose was something he had long ago learned could make things worse. One morning, he noticed tire tracks in his driveway that didn't belong. They were faint, almost careless, but deliberate enough to be noticed by someone paying attention. He stepped outside, scanned the street, and didn't see anyone. But he remembered the tracks. He memorized them, their direction, and the type of vehicle. Every detail mattered. That day, he went to work as usual. People in the office greeted him warmly, unaware of the subtle tension building around his home. He didn't talk about it. He couldn't. He had made a rule long ago. Let the world underestimate you. Let them see what they wanted to see. Underestimation was a powerful weapon. Back at home, he checked his security cameras. He didn't need them often. His instincts were sharp, trained through years of experience. But sometimes technology helped fill in the gaps. The footage showed a group of men lingering near his house, laughing too loudly, their movements casual but deliberate. Their faces were angry, their eyes filled with the kind of prejudice that had no logic, only malice. He watched them for a moment, silently assessing. They didn't know who he was. They couldn't imagine the life he had led before settling here. They didn't know that he had been trained to stay calm in situations far more dangerous than this. They didn't know that every move they made was being studied, cataloged, remembered. As the sun set, the neighborhood seemed calm again, but he sensed the tension in the air. It was a quiet, dangerous kind of tension, the kind that precedes action. He went inside, made dinner, and sat quietly, listening for sounds that didn't belong. His life had taught him to notice small things. The creak of a board, the scrape of a shoe, the whisper of wind carrying an unfamiliar voice. That night, sleep came slowly. His mind ran through scenarios, calculating outcomes, not out of fear but preparation. Preparation was key. He wasn't someone who panicked. He had faced far worse in his life, things that most people couldn't imagine. But here, in this quiet neighborhood, he faced a different kind of challenge, the subtle cruelty of people who thought they could intimidate him. He thought about the neighborhood children who waved at him each morning. He thought about the elderly couple next door who had once asked for help carrying groceries. He thought about the ordinary lives being disrupted by hate that had no reason to exist, and he realized quietly that he would not let them down. Not because he sought revenge, but because he understood the importance of justice even in small ways. Over the next few days, he noticed more signs. Trash bins knocked over in his yard. Graffiti on the sidewalk near his home, crude and offensive. Tires slashed on cars parked nearby. The gang was becoming bolder, confident that he would do nothing. Most people in the neighborhood would have panicked, called the police immediately, or confronted the vandals without thinking. He did none of that. He watched, learned, and waited. He remembered lessons from his past, lessons that had kept him alive in situations far worse than this. Observation first, control second, and patience above all. Every action must have purpose. Every reaction must be deliberate. He followed these principles now, calmly noting the times when the gang struck, their methods, their numbers, their weaknesses. Neighbors began to whisper about him. "He's strange," they said. Quiet, too quiet, some avoided him. Others, curious, tried to engage in small talk, hoping to understand him better. He responded politely, but never revealed more than he wanted. No one could guess the truth behind his calm exterior. One afternoon, he went to the local store. The gang was there too, leaning against cars, talking loudly, trying to intimidate anyone who passed. He noticed them immediately. He didn't react. He simply observed, mentally recording their voices, their gestures, the way they moved together. He could have confronted them then and there, but confrontation without preparation was pointless. He knew it. When he returned home, he found a note pinned to his door. It was more aggressive than before. The words were hateful, threatening, meant to provoke fear. Most people would have panicked, called friends or family, maybe even the authorities. But he simply took the note inside, read it carefully, and placed it on the counter. He didn't feel anger. He didn't feel fear. He felt clarity. He understood that this was only the beginning, and that how he responded next would define the rest of the situation. He spent the evening preparing. Not weapons, not traps, but strategies. Plans to protect himself, his home, and the community around him. He reviewed every detail he could remember, connecting them in his mind, creating patterns, finding vulnerabilities. His experience had taught him that knowledge was power, and he had plenty. As night fell, the neighborhood seemed quiet again. But he knew better. The calm was temporary. The gang believed they were in control, that he was just another man, weak and unprepared. They didn't know the truth. They couldn't imagine the life he had lived before moving here, the skills he had learned, the strength he carried quietly. He sat in his living room, listening to the faint sounds of the night, a car passing, the wind through the trees, a dog barking in the distance, and he smiled slightly, not because he was happy, but because he knew what most people didn't. He was ready. He didn't need to show his strength yet. He didn't need to prove anything. The moment would come when action was necessary, and when it did, those who had underestimated him would see the truth. And so, the quiet man in the quiet neighborhood prepared. The calm before the storm was ending, and soon the world that had thought it could intimidate him would learn that appearances could be deceiving. He had lived a life where control, patience, and precision had saved him countless times. And now in this suburban street, those same principles would guide him again. No one knew it yet. But the man they thought was ordinary was anything but. The next morning, he woke to an unusual quiet. It was the kind of quiet that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He had learned to trust these instincts, honed over years of training and experience. Something was about to happen. He didn't know when, but he knew it was coming. As he stepped outside, the first signs were clear. His mailbox had been ripped from its post and thrown across the lawn. A tire track cut across the grass, leading away from the street and into the distance. He knelt to examine the soil, noticing footprints pressed into the damp earth. They were sloppy, careless, but deliberate enough to send a message. Someone had been here, and they wanted him to see it. He stood slowly, surveying his surroundings. A few neighbors were outside, watching from behind fences and blinds. Their eyes darted toward him, uncertain, afraid. They whispered to each other, their voices low and nervous. Some had seen the tracks, some had seen the mailbox. None of them understood what they were witnessing. They didn't know the kind of man who lived in that house. They didn't know the life he had lived, the skills he carried quietly beneath the calm exterior. The gang arrived later that morning, just as he had expected. A group of men, brash and loud, walking confidently toward his home. They carried tools, bats, crowbars, and bricks. Their laughter was cruel, sharp, and meant to intimidate. They moved as if they owned the street, as if no one could stop them, and in a way they were right. No ordinary man could stop them. But he wasn't ordinary. He watched from his window, his expression unreadable. His mind catalogued everything: the number of men, their positions, the weapons they carried, the way they moved together. He noticed the smallest details: a twitch of the eye, a shift in weight, the hesitation in one man's step. These were weaknesses, and he would remember them. Every action had a consequence. Every movement could be predicted. The first attack began with noise. Bricks smashed against windows, sending shards of glass across the living room floor. He remained calm, listening carefully. He could hear the crunch of the mailbox underfoot, the scrape of shoes on the porch. The gang was chaotic, disorganized. They had confidence but no strategy. They assumed that fear would control him. They assumed wrong. They began shouting, their words full of hate, full of threats. Most people would have panicked, but he did not. He had learned long ago that anger and fear were tools of the untrained mind. His mind was trained to stay clear, to calculate, to prepare. He stayed inside, watching the chaos unfold, waiting for the right moment. Through the broken window, he could see the damage clearly. Furniture overturned, a vase shattered on the floor, the remnants of personal items scattered across the yard. The gang laughed, thinking they had won. They didn't understand that destruction was only the surface, a distraction from what was to come. He didn't call the police immediately. He didn't scream or fight back in the moment. He moved quietly, checking his home for any vulnerabilities. He ensured his family, if anyone else were home, was safe. Even though he lived alone, his instinct was to protect. Protection was always the first priority. Then came strategy. Then came action. He remembered flashbacks from his past. Intense missions, long nights of surveillance, situations where he had to anticipate every move of dangerous men. He used that training now, even in the quiet suburb, even against these small-minded attackers. His mind worked faster than the gang could imagine, predicting their next steps, preparing countermeasures without revealing a single clue. The gang grew more reckless. One man climbed the fence to enter the backyard, smashing a lamp as he went. Another threw a chair into the side window. Yet another tried to break the front door with a crowbar. They were loud, violent, and foolish. Every move they made exposed them further. Every mistake was an opportunity, and he was watching. He stepped outside finally, not in anger but in controlled observation. He walked calmly across the yard, assessing the damage, noting every detail. The gang froze slightly, surprised by his composure. Most people would have been screaming, shouting, reacting with fear. But he simply walked, his movements slow, deliberate, like a predator observing prey. "Is that all you've got?" he said calmly, his voice steady and even. The words were simple, but they carried weight. The gang hesitated, unsure how to respond. Their confidence wavered when faced with someone who didn't react like a victim. Their laughter faded slightly, replaced by uncertainty. They didn't see the muscles beneath his shirt, the trained reflexes ready to act at a moment's notice. They didn't see the calm in his eyes, the calculation in his stance. They didn't know the man they had chosen to attack was not just strong, but extremely skilled, trained for situations far worse than this. Instead, they made a mistake. One man stepped too close, swinging a bat in an attempt to intimidate him. He didn't dodge immediately. He simply moved slightly to the side, letting the swing pass harmlessly. His movement was precise, effortless, almost invisible. The man lost balance, stumbled, and fell, hitting the ground hard. The others gasped, surprised by the ease of the maneuver. He didn't laugh. He didn't gloat. He simply assessed again, noting their reactions, their fear, their confusion. He had never wanted to humiliate anyone unnecessarily. He wanted to stop the threat, and he would do so with efficiency and precision. The gang regrouped, trying to regain confidence. But he stayed calm, always observing, always anticipating. He could see the cracks forming in their coordination, the uncertainty creeping into their movements. They had expected a victim, someone who would scream, someone who would panic. Instead, they faced a man who was unshakable, deliberate, and completely aware of every move they made. They tried one last attempt. Two men rushed toward him together, trying to catch him off guard. He didn't flinch. He didn't panic. He moved, with calculated speed, sidestepping one, redirecting the other with minimal effort. They stumbled, collided, and fell to the ground. Their momentum carried them awkwardly, and they hit each other harder than they hit him. Neighbors watched, unable to believe what they were seeing. Some had peeked from behind curtains. Others had come outside quietly. No one expected a quiet man in a suburban neighborhood to handle the situation with such calm, precision, and skill. They didn't know his past. They didn't know he had been trained for life-and-death situations far beyond anything they had imagined. By now, the gang was panicked. Their laughter was gone, replaced by fear. They were disorganized, confused, and uncertain. Their weapons were still in their hands, but they hesitated to use them, afraid of the consequences. And they should have been. Every move they had made had been calculated, recorded, and remembered by someone far beyond their skill level. He spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "Leave, now. You're done here." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten unnecessarily. But there was authority in his tone, a weight that made them hesitate. They glanced at each other, uncertainty in their eyes. Finally, slowly, they backed away. One of them tried to scowl, to seem brave, but the courage didn't last. They turned, scattered, and ran back toward the street, leaving behind the chaos they had created. He walked through his yard, inspecting the damage again. Broken glass, overturned furniture, scattered belongings, but he felt no anger. He felt clarity. He had survived the attack, assessed the threat, and neutralized it without unnecessary violence. The lesson had been delivered quietly, efficiently, and most importantly, no one had been seriously hurt. The neighbors slowly came out of hiding, their eyes wide with amazement. Whispers spread quickly. "Did you see that?" one asked. "He handled them all by himself." Another added, "I didn't think anyone could do that." But he said nothing. He simply went inside, cleaned up what he could, and prepared for the next steps. The attack had been just the beginning, and he knew it. That night, he sat quietly in his living room, listening to the faint sounds outside. The neighborhood had returned to its usual quiet, but he knew the gang might come back. They had tasted fear and failure, and some would try again. But he would be ready. He always was. He had been trained for moments like this, trained to stay calm, prepared, and strategic. He thought about the principle he had always lived by: control, patience, and precision. Today, he had demonstrated all three, and the world around him, the neighbors, the gang, anyone watching, had begun to see a glimpse of the man they had underestimated. They didn't know the full story, not yet, but they would soon learn that appearances were deceiving, and that he was not a man to be underestimated. And so, as the night settled in and the stars appeared overhead, he sat calmly, knowing that the first battle had been won, but the larger struggle for peace and justice in his quiet neighborhood had only just begun. He had faced the attack, remained calm, and shown strength without unnecessary aggression. And in that moment he understood something clearly. Fear had no place in his life, and hatred would not control him. After the attack, he didn't sleep much. He spent the night thinking, reviewing every detail in his mind, replaying the events like a careful strategist going over a mission. He wasn't angry. He wasn't scared. He was focused on understanding what had happened, why it had happened, and what would come next. The gang had shown their face, their intent, and their weakness. That knowledge was more valuable than fear. The next morning he began to prepare, not with weapons or traps, not with anger, but with careful observation and planning. He needed to know everything about the people who had attacked his home, who they were when they moved, how they acted, what they feared. Knowledge would be his weapon, and patience would be his shield. He started quietly. First, he spoke to a few neighbors he trusted, casually asking if they had noticed anything unusual in recent days. Some admitted to hearing loud noises. Some had seen shadows near their homes, but most were too afraid to intervene. He noted their observations, connecting them with his own knowledge from the night of the attack. Every small detail mattered. He checked the security cameras again. This time, he expanded the range of his observation, looking not just at his own property but at nearby streets. He could see patterns forming, small movements, cars that appeared frequently, faces that lingered too long. The gang was careless, confident, and predictable in ways they didn't realize. He memorized everything. He even noted the time of day when they tended to move, when they felt most powerful and least watched. In the days that followed, he began to act subtly in the neighborhood. He wasn't confrontational. He was strategic. He walked the streets at different times, observing from a distance, blending in while noticing details others overlooked. He paid attention to the gang's hangouts, their casual meetings, and the way they communicated. He saw their weaknesses, the small mistakes, the hesitations, the arrogance that made them predictable. He also prepared his home for any further attacks. He repaired broken windows, secured doors, and made sure that if the gang returned, they would find no opportunity for easy intimidation. But he didn't overreact. He had learned long ago that a calm environment projected strength. Panic, fear, or excessive measures could give away vulnerability. His house would stand calm and unyielding, just like him. Despite his focus on the gang, he also continued his daily life, blending into the neighborhood as if nothing had happened. He went to work, he greeted neighbors politely, he performed normal tasks. To outsiders, he seemed unchanged, ordinary, unremarkable. But beneath that ordinary exterior, he was always calculating, always preparing. One afternoon, he spotted a familiar figure from a distance. It was one of the men from the gang, standing outside a convenience store watching the street. He didn't approach. He didn't react. He simply observed, noting the man's posture, gestures, and companions. The man seemed confident, almost smug, unaware that he was being studied by someone far more capable than himself. He spent the next several days gathering information. He noted the gang's habits, where they met, how they communicated, and even small personal details that could later help him predict their actions. Every observation built a picture in his mind, a map of their weaknesses, their tendencies, their vulnerabilities. He didn't rush. He didn't act impulsively. He had learned that preparation and patience were more powerful than force alone. At the same time, he reflected on why the gang had targeted him. It wasn't personal in the sense he had done anything to provoke them. It was prejudice, fear, and a desire to dominate someone who didn't conform to their narrow view of the world. That understanding didn't make him angry, it gave him clarity. People acted out of weakness and ignorance, not power. Recognizing this allowed him to remain calm and deliberate. He began to develop a plan, one that didn't rely on brute force. It relied on his knowledge, his skill, and his ability to remain invisible until the perfect moment. He imagined different scenarios, each with careful contingencies. He considered how to confront the gang so that they would understand the consequences of their actions without creating unnecessary danger for himself or others. He also used this time to mentally prepare himself. He remembered missions from his past where patience had been critical, where acting too soon could have been deadly. He remembered training exercises that required precision, observation, and control. Every memory strengthened his resolve. He wasn't preparing for violence. He was preparing for justice. At home, he reinforced his focus. He walked through each room, checking entry points, planning escape routes, and visualizing possible situations. He ensured he could act with maximum efficiency if confronted again. He also reminded himself to stay calm. Fear or anger would cloud judgment, and he couldn't afford that. Clarity was everything. As he watched the neighborhood over the next few days, he noticed changes in the gang. They became bolder in small ways, leaving trash in his yard, yelling from across the street, trying to intimidate from a distance. But their actions were sloppy, disorganized, and predictable. He noted each act carefully. He knew that their overconfidence would be their weakness. He also began to notice subtle signs in the neighborhood. Some neighbors were beginning to speak quietly about what had happened. Whispers of admiration and curiosity started spreading. People who had been too afraid to act were watching, hoping for someone to take control. He didn't seek attention, but he recognized that his presence had already begun to shift perceptions. One afternoon, he noticed two gang members arguing loudly near a street corner. Their disagreement was minor, but it revealed cracks in their organization. One was frustrated with another for being careless. Another was worried about being noticed by neighbors. These small fissures were valuable information. They were weaknesses he could use to his advantage without confrontation. He also began small acts to subtly warn the gang that he was not someone to be underestimated. Not threats, not displays of force, but subtle indications of awareness. He would appear unexpectedly in the yard, glance toward the street with calm intensity, and then disappear. He never spoke, never acted aggressively, but the message was clear. He was watching. The gang began to notice. They were unsure of his abilities, their confidence faltering. They wondered if the quiet man had called the police, if he had neighbors helping him, if there was some unseen plan. Their fear was growing, and he had done nothing overt to provoke it. The fear was a result of his presence alone, his calm, his observation, and the unspoken knowledge that he was not to be underestimated. He also considered how to handle the situation if the gang returned with more force. He didn't want unnecessary violence, but he understood the need for preparation. He planned escape routes, safety measures, and ways to ensure the community was safe. He wanted resolution, not chaos, and his focus on strategy ensured that any confrontation would be controlled. During this time, he reflected on the lessons he had learned from his life before moving to the neighborhood. Years of intense training, missions in dangerous environments, and situations where failure was not an option had shaped him into a man of discipline, calm, and intelligence. These lessons were now applied to a very different kind of challenge, a challenge in his own home, in a quiet neighborhood threatened by ignorance and hate. He also considered the human side of the situation. The gang were people, flawed, misguided, and fearful. They acted out of weakness, not strength. Understanding this allowed him to remain in control emotionally. He was not fueled by hatred, not seeking revenge. He sought clarity, protection, and justice. This mindset made him even more formidable. By the end of the week, he had everything he needed: knowledge of the gang, understanding of their patterns, insight into their weaknesses, and a carefully crafted plan. He was ready for the next steps. Not with aggression, not with blind anger, but with deliberate, calculated action. He also began thinking about the community. Some neighbors were still afraid, but others had started to see the situation differently. They noticed his calmness, his control, and his presence. Without realizing it, he had begun to inspire them, showing that strength did not always roar. It sometimes waited quietly, observed and acted with precision when necessary. Late one evening, he stood on his porch looking at the street. The moonlight cast long shadows, and the quiet was heavy. He could almost feel the tension in the air. The gang had not yet returned, but he knew they would. They were predictable, careless, and driven by arrogance. And when they came, he would be ready. He smiled slightly, not with arrogance, but with confidence. The calm, quiet man in the neighborhood was not ordinary. He was patient, intelligent, and prepared. And soon, the people who had tried to intimidate him would see the truth. They would see that under his calm exterior was a man who could handle far worse, a man who understood control, patience, and strategy better than anyone around him. And so, he prepared silently, carefully, and deliberately. Every observation, every step, every thought was part of a plan. The gang had underestimated him, the neighbors had underestimated him, and the world around him had underestimated him. But he knew the truth. Appearances could be deceiving, and the man they thought they knew was far more capable than anyone could imagine. The quiet moments, the careful observations, and the patient planning had brought him to this point. Soon, action would be necessary, and when it came, he would act with precision, intelligence, and restraint. The calm before the storm was ending, and the man who had been underestimated for too long was ready to reveal the truth of who he really was. The tension in the neighborhood had been building quietly for days, and he could feel it now more than ever. He knew the gang had been waiting, watching, trying to decide their next move. They were arrogant, reckless, and growing desperate. That desperation made them dangerous, but it also made them predictable. He had spent days observing, planning, and preparing for this moment. Now the time had come to act. It began in the early evening. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the streets. He noticed movement near the corner where the gang often gathered. They were laughing and talking, pretending not to notice him, but he could see the subtle tension in their posture. They were testing the boundaries, trying to intimidate him from a distance. He didn't move immediately. He waited, observing carefully, calculating their behavior and noting every small detail. Then he acted. Not with anger, not with force, but with calm precision. He stepped outside, walking slowly across his yard. He didn't raise his voice, didn't shout or threaten. His presence alone was enough to make them pause. There was something about the way he moved, the way he carried himself, that radiated confidence and control. They stopped laughing, their eyes widening slightly as they registered his calm, deliberate stance. One of the gang members stepped forward, trying to assert dominance. "You think you can stop us?" He sneered, swinging a bat loosely in his hand. But the man he had underestimated so far didn't flinch. He simply looked at him calmly, assessing, waiting. In that brief moment, the gang member realized something he hadn't expected. This man was unshakable, and he was watching every movement, every gesture, with precision. The gang moved as a group, trying to surround him. Their confidence faltered slightly, and their movements became disorganized. They were used to scaring people with noise, chaos, and aggression. But he was different. He didn't panic, he didn't react impulsively, and he didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing fear. Instead, he observed, analyzing their mistakes, noting the gaps in their coordination, and silently predicting their next moves. A few tried to rush him at once, swinging bats and throwing objects. He didn't dodge blindly. His movements were controlled, calculated. A step to the side, a slight shift of weight, and the first man stumbled, his momentum carrying him past harmlessly. Another reached out aggressively, only to lose balance as the calm, precise presence in front of him anticipated every action. The gang was faltering. They didn't realize it yet, but they had underestimated him completely. He didn't need to strike anyone to assert control. Every move he made was about positioning, timing, and awareness. He kept himself calm, his breathing steady, and his mind sharp. Each member of the gang began to hesitate, unsure how to act. Their arrogance had blinded them to his ability, and now fear began to creep into their movements. They were disorganized, reckless, and vulnerable. He took a deliberate step forward, not aggressively, but purposefully. The gang froze. The one who had tried to rush him swung wildly, missing by inches, and stumbled again. He caught his balance quickly, but the fear was already there. The gang was realizing that their usual tactics, the shouting, the swinging, the intimidation, were ineffective. They were facing someone who could anticipate, calculate, and respond without panic. At this point, some neighbors had quietly come outside, watching from a distance. They stayed hidden, unsure whether to intervene, but they were witnessing something extraordinary. The quiet man they had seen every day, the one who never drew attention, was now demonstrating a level of control and skill they couldn't have imagined. He was calm, deliberate, and in full command of the situation. He moved strategically, keeping a careful distance while controlling the space around him. Each member of the gang was observed, every subtle movement catalogued in his mind. They tried to regroup to regain confidence, but their coordination had broken down. One of them whispered a frustrated question. Another glanced nervously toward the street, and he saw the cracks in their unity widening with every passing second. Then he spoke, his voice calm but carrying authority. "This ends now. Leave this street. Leave this neighborhood. You've made your choices, and now it's time to face the consequences." His words were simple, but they resonated with a power that went beyond shouting or threats. There was no anger in his tone, only certainty. That certainty was heavier than any weapon they carried. One of the gang members hesitated, then tried to act aggressively again. But the calm man had anticipated it. A small step, a slight shift in position, and the aggressor's own momentum caused him to stumble, throwing him off balance and leaving him vulnerable. It was enough to break his confidence completely. The others saw it and faltered further. Their fear was growing, and they had no clear plan. The situation didn't need to escalate into violence. He didn't want to hurt anyone unnecessarily. His goal was control, clarity, and justice, not chaos. But he wanted the gang to understand one thing. They had chosen the wrong target, and their actions had consequences. They were being exposed for what they truly were, reckless, arrogant, and underestimated. As the confrontation continued, he noticed subtle signs of change. One of the gang members, usually the loudest and most aggressive, began to hesitate visibly. Another looked around nervously, clearly reconsidering his options. The group's cohesion had completely broken down. They no longer moved as a single unit. Each acted independently, unsure how to respond. He continued to project calm authority. His movements were deliberate, his observations precise. Every gesture, every glance reinforced that he was in control. The gang, once confident and brash, now faced a presence they could not intimidate. Fear and uncertainty were growing in their ranks, and the more they tried to act, the more mistakes they made. Neighbors began to whisper quietly among themselves, amazed at what they were seeing. The quiet man who had lived among them, who had seemed ordinary and unremarkable, was now displaying a level of skill, composure, and control that was almost unbelievable. They had underestimated him as the gang had, and now they were witnesses to the truth. After several tense minutes, the gang began to retreat. Their confidence shattered, their arrogance broken, they moved back toward the street, muttering among themselves, casting uneasy glances over their shoulders. He didn't pursue them. There was no need. Their retreat was confirmation enough that the lesson had been learned. The presence of a man who was calm, deliberate, and capable had been enough to neutralize their threat completely. He watched them leave, noting every movement, every hesitation. This was not just a victory. It was evidence that preparation, observation, and patience could overcome recklessness and aggression. He returned to his yard, walking slowly as he assessed the aftermath. Broken trash cans, scattered debris, and the faint signs of their previous attacks were all that remained. The gang had caused chaos, but their intimidation had failed. Once inside, he began to clean up methodically, handling the broken items with care and efficiency. His mind was still active, analyzing what had happened, planning for any potential follow-up. He knew the gang might try again, though unlikely. The fear and uncertainty he had instilled were likely to keep them at bay. But he didn't rely on assumptions. He prepared, always ready for the unexpected. Later that night, he reflected on the day's events. The gang had underestimated him, as most people did, and they had paid the price, not through violence, but through exposure, hesitation, and fear. They had been predictable because they acted without thinking, while he had acted with observation, strategy, and calm precision. The contrast was clear. Intelligence and patience were far more powerful than reckless aggression. He also thought about the neighbors who had watched quietly. Some were still afraid, but many had begun to see him differently. They understood now that appearances could be deceiving. The quiet man among them was not ordinary. He was disciplined, prepared, and fully aware of his surroundings. His calmness was not weakness, it was strength. By the end of the night, the street was silent again. The gang had disappeared, their presence no longer a threat. The quiet man walked to his porch, looking at the neighborhood around him. There was relief, yes, but also clarity. This confrontation had been a necessary test, a moment to show that control, patience, and intelligence could overcome recklessness and hatred. He sat quietly, reflecting on the principles that had guided him. Observation first, preparation second, and action only when necessary. Today had proven that these principles were timeless, effective, and powerful. He had faced the threat, remained calm, and ensured that justice, not chaos, prevailed. And in that quiet, controlled way, the neighborhood had changed. People had seen strength without arrogance, control without aggression, and intelligence without hostility. The gang had learned their lesson, and the quiet man had shown that even in a suburban street, underestimation could be dangerous. He closed his eyes briefly, allowing himself a small moment of satisfaction. The confrontation was over. The lesson had been delivered, and the neighborhood could now begin to recover. But he remained vigilant, knowing that peace required constant awareness. He had acted with clarity, precision, and restraint, and those principles would guide him in whatever came next. The quiet man in the neighborhood had revealed a truth. Strength was not always loud, courage was not always visible, and wisdom often came wrapped in calm, deliberate action. And now, everyone who had witnessed the events of the day knew that underestimating him had been a grave mistake. After the gang had retreated, the neighborhood slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The quiet streets, the morning sun filtering through the trees, and the soft hum of life resuming made everything seem normal again. But for him, life had changed. The attack had left marks not just on his property, but on the awareness of the people around him. They now understood that he was not someone to be underestimated, and that realization had shifted the energy in the neighborhood. He began the day by inspecting the damage more thoroughly. Broken trash cans, cracked windows, and scattered debris were reminders of what had happened. He didn't rush or panic. He approached the cleanup methodically, taking his time to fix what could be fixed and to organize what remained. He believed in restoring not just the physical space, but the sense of security that had been disrupted. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, some shyly, some with curiosity. They had watched the confrontation and now they were